What happens when you stop praying for a while? Not because you stopped believing, not because you stopped loving God, but because life became heavy, your heart became quiet, and now you're afraid that the silence changed something between you and Him. You miss the peace you used to feel. You want to come back, but guilty keeps whispering that maybe you waited too long. Maybe you've disappointed God. Maybe He feels as distant as He seems. And the question that scares you the most isn't why you stopped praying. It's what happened while you were silent, and whether God has been silent too. Maybe you never planned to stop praying. Maybe there was no dramatic decision, no moment when you consciously turned away from God. Life simply became heavy. The pressure increased. The responsibilities multiplied. The disappointments accumulated. And somewhere in the middle of trying to survive emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, prayer slowly became quieter. At first, you thought it was temporary. You told yourself you would pray tomorrow. You would reconnect next week. You would return when things felt more normal. But somehow, days became weeks. And weeks, perhaps, became months. And now, something inside you feels different. Not because you stopped believing in God. Not because you suddenly rejected faith, but because you no longer know how to return to the place where prayer once felt natural. Perhaps what troubles you most is not the silence itself. It is the fear behind the silence. A fear you rarely say out loud. Have I disappointed God? Has He become distant from me? Did I drift too far? Why does He feel so far away? And maybe the hardest question of all, what happens when you stop praying for a while? These questions are often carried quietly. Many people who love God deeply experience seasons they never expected. Seasons where their faith feels weak. Seasons where their minds are exhausted. Seasons where their prayers become shorter, less frequent, or disappear altogether. And when that happens, shame usually arrives before understanding. You begin comparing yourself to who you used to be. You remember when prayer seemed easier. You remember moments when God's presence felt real. You remember the peace that used to settle your anxious thoughts. And now, you wonder what changed. You wonder if something inside you broke. You wonder if your spiritual growth somehow reversed. You wonder whether God became disappointed with your inconsistency. Because deep down, many believers secretly assume something they would never say directly. They assume God's love becomes weaker when their devotion becomes weaker. They assume His nearness depends on their performance. They assume that if they fail to maintain spiritual consistency, God slowly steps away. And perhaps, without realizing it, they begin hiding. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually. The strange thing about shame is that it makes you avoid the very place where healing exists. You miss prayer. You miss peace. You miss feeling connected. But guilt whispers that you do not deserve to come back yet. Maybe you need to become stronger first. Maybe you need to fix yourself first. Maybe you need to pray perfectly again. Maybe you need to prove something. So instead of seeking God, you wait. And while you wait, fear grows. The silence becomes heavier. The distance feels greater. Not necessarily because God moved, but because shame has a way of convincing you that you should stay hidden. And hidden pain often creates hidden questions. Questions you may have carried for a long time. Why do I feel so spiritually dry? Why does prayer feel difficult now? Why am I so tired? Why does my mind constantly Why do I still believe in God but struggle to talk to Him? Why do I feel guilty every time I think about prayer? And perhaps you have mistaken emotional exhaustion for spiritual failure. Because life has a way of draining people. Disappointments drain people. Unanswered prayers drain people. Waiting drains people. Grief drains people. Anxiety drains people. Sometimes you become so busy surviving that you do not even notice how tired your soul has become. And tired souls often become quiet, not rebellious, not unbelieving, simply tired. Yet many people interpret that exhaustion as proof that something is wrong with them. They tell themselves that strong faith should always feel passionate. Strong faith should always feel consistent. Strong faith should always feel joyful. But real life rarely works that way. Even emotionally healthy people experience seasons of weariness. Even faithful people experience confusion. Even people who love God experience moments where their thoughts become noisy and their hearts become silent. And maybe that realization alone challenges something you have believed for years. Because perhaps you assumed spiritual struggles only happen to weak believers. Perhaps you assumed mature Christians never experience dryness. Perhaps you assumed faith should eliminate every internal battle. But what if spiritual dryness does not necessarily mean spiritual death? What if feeling exhausted does not mean your faith is gone? What if silence is not proof that God abandoned you? What if your feelings have been telling a story that truth does not actually support? Because feelings are powerful, and yet feelings are not always accurate. Fear feels true. Shame feels true. Anxiety feels true. Distance feels true. But feelings and truth are not always the same thing. And that tension creates one of the deepest battles believers face. The battle between what you feel and what is actually true. You may feel forgotten, but are you? You may feel abandoned. But were you abandoned? You may feel far away, but who actually moved? These questions become uncomfortable because they force us to examine not just our emotions, but our understanding of God. Because maybe the greatest pain is not that prayer became difficult. Maybe the greatest pain is what you think that difficulty means. You fear that God's patience has limits. You fear that His love became weaker. You fear that His invitation expired. You fear that He grew tired of your inconsistency. And if those fears are true, then returning feels impossible. Because how do you come back to someone you believe is disappointed in you? How do you approach someone you imagine is frustrated with you? How do you pray when guilt keeps reminding you of everything you failed to do? And so you remain trapped, missing God, thinking about God, wanting peace, wanting hope, wanting faith, yet feeling unable to take even the smallest step. Meanwhile, another question quietly grows inside your heart. If God truly loves me, why does He seem silent? Why do I no longer sense His presence the way I once did? Why does prayer feel different now? And perhaps the answer is not what you think, because there is something many believers misunderstand during seasons like these. Something that changes the entire picture. Something that reveals that spiritual dryness is not always what it appears to be. Something that exposes the difference between emotional exhaustion and spiritual abandonment. And perhaps, before you conclude that your faith is dying, there is a truth you have not fully understood yet. Because what if the silence you fear does not mean God has stopped listening? What if your weakness has not surprised Him at all? What if your season of quiet has not pushed Him away? And what if, even now, while you are wondering whether you disappointed Him, He is much nearer than you imagine? Because the real story behind your silence may be very different from the one fear has been telling you all along. There is a painful assumption many people make when they go through a season of spiritual dryness. They assume that because they feel disconnected, they must actually be disconnected. Because they do not feel strong, they conclude that their faith is weak. Because prayer became difficult, they assume God became distant. Because they are exhausted, they believe something is wrong with them spiritually. But what if those conclusions are built more on fear than on truth? What if the problem is not that your faith died, but that your heart became tired? There is a difference. An understanding that difference changes everything. Because exhaustion and rebellion are not the same thing, weakness and unbelief are not the same thing. Silence and abandonment are not the same thing. Yet when anxiety fills the mind, everything begins to feel darker than it really is. You start interpreting every struggle as evidence that you are failing God. Every unanswered prayer feels personal. Every difficult season feels like punishment. Every emotional low becomes proof that God has withdrawn. And before long, you are carrying burdens that He never asked you to carry. Perhaps you remember praying faithfully. You remember asking God to help you. You trusted, you waited, you hoped, and then life became confusing. Maybe certain prayers were never answered the way you expected. Maybe some situations lasted far longer than you thought they would. Maybe you kept asking for healing, for peace, for direction, for clarity, for relief. And instead of immediate answers, you encountered silence, not necessarily complete silence. but enough silence to leave you wondering, enough waiting to make you tired, enough disappointment to make your heart quieter. Because unanswered expectations can slowly drain the soul, not all at once, but little by little. You do not wake up one morning deciding to stop praying. You simply become weary, and weariness has a strange effect on the mind. It creates questions. Why keep praying? Will anything change? Does God even hear me? Am I asking wrong? Have I done something wrong? And sometimes those questions are accompanied by anxiety. Not dramatic anxiety, but constant thoughts, overthinking, mental exhaustion, the inability to rest, the fear of the future, the pressure to hold everything together. And while the body becomes tired, the heart becomes quiet. Yet what many believers fail to understand is that God understands weakness far better than we do. He knows the limits of human emotions. He understands grief. He understands disappointment. He understands confusion. He understands tears that never become words. He understands prayers that remain unfinished. He understands nights filled with He understands the exhaustion that nobody else sees. And perhaps you have been expecting yourself to function like a machine, always strong, always hopeful, always consistent, always joyful, always confident. But human beings were never designed to live without limits. Even your mind has limits. Even your emotions have limits. Even your heart experiences seasons. And perhaps you have judged yourself more harshly than God has. Because many people expect compassion from God for everyone except themselves. They believe He is patient with others, merciful with others, kind toward others. But somehow they imagine that He treats them differently, as though their weakness is too much, as though their inconsistency exhausted His patience, as though their silence surprised Him. But God has never been shocked by human weakness. He has never discovered something about you that He did not already know. He knew your struggles before you knew them. He knew your fears before you understood them. He knew your seasons of waiting before they arrived. And He knew that there would be moments when your faith would feel stronger than others. Because spiritual growth is not a straight line. It never has been. Sometimes growth feels exciting. Sometimes growth feels quiet. Sometimes growth feels confusing. Sometimes growth feels invisible. And sometimes growth happens in ways you cannot even recognize while you are living through them, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if your spiritual dryness is not evidence that God left? What if it is evidence that you are human? Because humans become tired. Humans become discouraged. Humans wrestle with disappointment. Humans struggle with hope. Humans battle anxious thoughts. Humans grow weary while waiting. And waiting itself is one of the hardest experiences of faith, because waiting forces you to live without complete answers. Waiting forces you to trust when emotions are uncertain. Waiting forces you to face fears you cannot control. And perhaps that is why waiting often exposes what is happening inside the heart. Not because God is punishing you, but because uncertainty reveals where fear and faith are fighting each other. Maybe that battle has been taking place inside you for a long time. Part of you still trusts God. Part of you still believes. Part of you still longs for Him. But another part feels disappointed. Another part feels confused. Another part feels tired. And these emotions create internal tension. You love God, but you do not understand what He's doing. You believe He is good, but life has been painful. You trust Him, yet you are afraid. And because these feelings seem contradictory, many believers begin condemning themselves. They think faith means never struggling. Faith means never questioning. Faith means never feeling weary. But real faith is often much more honest than that. Real faith sometimes says, I believe, but I am tired. Real faith sometimes says, I trust you, but I do not understand. Real faith sometimes says, I want to pray, but I do not even know what to say. And perhaps God is not offended by those moments. Perhaps He sees something deeper. Because underneath the exhaustion, underneath the anxiety, underneath the disappointment, something remains. You still care. You still long for Him. You still wonder. You still hope. And maybe that hope itself is evidence that your faith is far more alive than fear wants you to believe. Because dead things do not hunger. Dead things do not seek. Dead things do not miss God's peace. Dead things do not grieve over distance. The very fact that your heart misses Him may reveal something beautiful. It may reveal that your relationship with God is not gone. It may reveal that beneath the confusion, love still exists. And perhaps that is why spiritual dryness should not automatically be interpreted as spiritual death, because seasons exist. Winter does not mean life disappeared. It simply means growth looks different. Roots develop underground long before fruit becomes visible. And many of God's deepest works are invisible before they become visible, which means something important may be happening that your emotions cannot yet recognize. But there is another struggle that often hides underneath spiritual exhaustion. A misunderstanding that quietly produces guilt, a misunderstanding that causes people to believe they must somehow earn their way back to God. And that misunderstanding changes prayer itself, because eventually, prayer stops feeling like an invitation. It starts feeling like a test, like a duty, like a performance, like something you must do correctly to keep God pleased. And perhaps without realizing it, you have begun viewing prayer through the eyes of fear instead of relationship. But what if prayer was never meant to be a performance? What if God has always desired something much simpler? And what if the reason shame feels so powerful is because it depends on a lie that many sincere believers have accepted without ever questioning? Because the truth about prayer may be far more freeing than you have imagined. One of the most exhausting burdens a believer can carry is not suffering itself. It is the belief that God's love depends on spiritual performance. Because once that belief settles into the heart, prayer slowly stops feeling safe. It stops feeling personal. It stops feeling like a relationship. And it begins to feel like a responsibility you are constantly failing. Maybe you have experienced that without even realizing it. Every time you thought about praying, guilt appeared. You remembered how long it had been. You remembered your inconsistency. You remembered the promises you made and did not keep. And instead of feeling invited, you felt accused. So prayer became uncomfortable, not because you stopped loving God, but because somewhere along the way, you began believing that you had to earn your way back. And that is a heavy burden to carry. Because how much prayer is enough? How many days of consistency make you acceptable again? How much effort is required before God is pleased? How much guilt must you feel before you deserve peace again? Fear always asks these questions because fear depends on performance. Grace does not. And perhaps without noticing it, you have been relating to God as though He were waiting for you to prove yourself. As though He was standing at a distance with crossed arms. As though He were saying, "Come back when you are serious." As though His love rises and falls according to your spiritual success. But what if that image of God is completely wrong? What if the God you fear disappointing has never stopped looking at you with compassion? Because prayer was never designed to be a spiritual scorecard. It was never created to measure your worth. It was never intended to become another source of pressure. Prayer was always meant to be about relationship, not performance, not perfection. Relationship. And relationships are very different from performances. In a performance, mistakes lead to rejection. In a relationship, mistakes create opportunities for restoration. In a performance, you are valued for what you do. In a relationship, you are loved because you belong. In a performance, failure means disqualification. In a relationship, weakness becomes an invitation for closeness. Yet many believers live as though God operates like a demanding supervisor instead of a loving father. They imagine that every missed prayer disappoints Him. Every bad day frustrates Him. Every struggle weakens His affection. But God's love was never built on your consistency. Because if His love depended on perfect consistency, nobody would survive. Nobody. Not one person. Every believer has experienced seasons of weakness. Every believer has experienced doubts. Every believer has struggled with fear. Every believer has faced moments when faith felt fragile. The difference is not the absence of weakness. The difference is understanding who God remains to be in the middle of weakness. Because God's character does not change every time your emotions change. His faithfulness does not fluctuate according to your mood. His love does not disappear because you had a difficult season. His patience does not run out because life overwhelmed you. And perhaps this truth feels difficult to accept because human relationships often work differently. People disappoint us. People withdraw. People become frustrated. People grow impatient. People leave. And sometimes those experiences shape how we imagine God. Without realizing it, we project human limitations onto divine love. We assume God becomes tired the way people become tired. We assume He gives up the way people give up. We assume He keeps records the way fear keeps records. But His heart is not governed by fear, and perhaps one of the greatest misunderstandings in the Christian life is this. Many people believe God is reluctant to receive them, as though they have to convince Him, as though they have to beg Him, as though they have to make up for lost time. But what if He is not reluctant? What if He has never been reluctant? What if His desire to have fellowship with you is greater than your fear of returning? Because prayer was never supposed to be eloquent. It was never supposed to be impressive. It was never supposed to sound perfect. God has never been searching for flawless words. He has always been searching for honest hearts. And honest hearts do not always have beautiful sentences. Sometimes honest hearts only have tears. Sometimes honest hearts only have questions. Sometimes honest hearts only have silence. Sometimes honest hearts only know how to whisper, "God, I don't know what to say." And perhaps that simple sentence means more than you realize. Because relationship does not require perfection. Think about the people you love most. Do they have to speak perfectly to remain loved? Do they have to perform flawlessly to belong? Do they need impressive speeches to be welcomed? Of course not! Relationships are sustained by connection, not performance. And your relationship with God was never designed to be sustained by fear. Fear says, do more, try harder, earn it, prove yourself. But grace says something entirely different. Grace says, come, even now, even tired, even confused, even ashamed, even after the silence, even after the inconsistency, even after the disappointment. Because God's invitation has never depended on your ability to deserve it. And perhaps that is why shame fights so fiercely against your return. Because shame survives by convincing you that you are unwelcome. It whispers, not yet. You should be stronger first. You should pray better first. You should fix yourself first. You should become worthy first. But if you could make yourself worthy, grace would not be grace. And perhaps that is the lie that has exhausted so many sincere believers. They spend years trying to become acceptable instead of realizing they have already been invited. They spend years trying to earn what has always been offered. They spend years trying to impress the one who simply desires their heart. And that burden becomes especially painful when prayer has been absent for a while. Because then, guilt begins counting. Days, weeks, months, and the longer the silence lasts, the more impossible returning feels, until eventually, prayer itself becomes intimidating. You want to pray, but you do not know where to begin. You do not know what to say. You wonder if God is disappointed. You wonder if He still listens. You wonder if you waited too long. And perhaps the most beautiful truth is that God has never required grand speeches. He has never demanded spiritual perfection. He has never asked for polished words. He has always welcomed honesty. Because prayer is not about saying everything correctly. Prayer is about bringing your real heart into His presence, even when your heart is tired, even when your thoughts are anxious, even when your faith feels small, even when all you can say is, Lord, I miss you. But there is still another question that troubles many people. If God truly loves us like this, why do seasons of silence exist at all? Why does He sometimes seem quiet? Why do faithful people experience periods of waiting, weakness, and uncertainty? And perhaps the answer reveals something even more comforting. Because throughout Scripture, people who deeply loved God experienced moments that felt confusing, moments that felt quiet, moments where heaven seemed silent. Yet something remarkable remained true through all of it. God never stopped pursuing them. And maybe His heart toward you is far more faithful than your fears have allowed you to believe. There are moments in life when God's silence feels more painful than the problem itself. Because uncertainty has a way of exhausting the mind. You keep asking questions, you keep searching for answers, you keep wondering whether God is working. And when nothing seems to change, fear begins filling in the blanks. Maybe he stopped listening. Maybe he became distant. Maybe you disappointed him. Maybe your inconsistency pushed him away. And perhaps without realizing it, you begin interpreting silence as rejection. But silence and abandonment are not the same thing. They never have been. And one of the most comforting truths throughout Scripture is that God's faithfulness has never depended on human perfection. Again and again, people experienced waiting. Again and again, people experienced weakness. Again and again, people experienced confusion. Yet God remained faithful. Not because they always understood, not because they always responded perfectly, but because his character remained constant. And perhaps this is important for you to hear. God's commitment to you is rooted in who he is, not in how perfectly you perform. Because love that disappears during weakness was never true love to begin with. And God's love is not fragile. It is not easily offended. It is not dependent on your emotional strength. It does not disappear because your prayers became quieter. It does not abandon you because your thoughts became anxious. It does not withdraw because you had questions. And perhaps this challenges the image of God that fear has created inside your mind. Because fear paints God as impatient. Fear paints him as disappointed. Fear paints him as waiting for you to fix yourself. But throughout the Bible, something remarkable appears again and again. God pursues, he calls, he invites, he restores. Even when people wander, even when people struggle, even when people hide. And perhaps that truth reveals something beautiful about his heart, because love always moves toward restoration. Fear moves away. Shame hides. Love pursues. And maybe that is why one of the greatest mistakes believers make is assuming that God responds to their weakness the same way they respond to themselves. You condemn yourself. He offers grace. You focus on failure. He focuses on restoration. You remember your inconsistency. He remembers his faithfulness. You see, decency extends invitation. And perhaps the greatest difference between fear and truth is this. Fear says God walked away. Truth says God remained. Fear says you are alone. Truth says he is near. Fear says your silence ruined everything. Truth says his love was never built on your consistency. But then another question naturally arises. If God is near, why do I not always feel him? Why do I experience seasons where his presence seems hidden? Why do some prayers feel unanswered? Why do certain periods feel so quiet? These questions are deeply human, and they deserve honesty, because there are seasons when God does not seem as emotionally noticeable, seasons when peace feels harder to access, seasons when answers are delayed, seasons when understanding does not come quickly. And those moments can create tremendous internal tension, because your mind wants explanations, your emotions want relief, your heart wants reassurance. Yet life continues unfolding without immediate clarity. And perhaps one of the hardest realities of faith is learning that God's presence is not always measured by your emotions, because emotions are beautiful gifts, but they are not perfect indicators. Some days you feel close to God. Some days you do not. Some days peace comes easily. Some days anxiety is louder. Some days hope feels strong. Some days fear seems overwhelming. But truth does not change according to emotional weather. Clouds do not remove the sun. They only affect what you can see. And perhaps there are spiritual seasons that resemble cloudy days. Not because God disappeared, but because your vision feels limited. Your emotions feel heavy. Your mind feels tired. Your understanding feels incomplete. And during those moments, faith becomes less about feelings and more about trust. Not blind trust, but trust in God's character. Trust in who he has always been. Trust that his silence is not cruelty. Trust that his timing is not abandonment. Trust that his heart remains good even when life feels confusing. And perhaps this kind of trust develops in ways that excitement never could. Because anyone can trust when everything makes sense. Anyone can trust when answers arrive quickly. Anyone can trust when emotions feel strong. But deeper trust is formed when certainty disappears. And maybe that is why some of God's greatest work happens underground. Invisible, quiet, slow, like roots growing beneath the surface. No applause, no dramatic signs, no immediate results. Yet growth is taking place. And perhaps this is why spiritual maturity often feels less spectacular than people expect. Because real growth is not always emotional excitement. Sometimes it is simply continuing to trust while waiting, continuing to hope while confused, continuing to believe while unanswered questions remain. And perhaps you have underestimated what God has been doing inside you, because maybe you have been measuring growth by feelings, when God has been measuring something deeper: dependence, humility, perseverance, trust. And maybe the fact that you are still seeking answers reveals something beautiful. Because despite the fears, despite the silence, despite the exhaustion, despite the disappointment, you have not stopped longing for Him. And longing itself reveals relationship. Because hearts that no longer care do not seek. Hearts that no longer love do not hunger. Hearts that no longer trust do not wrestle. But you are wrestling. You are questioning. You are searching. And perhaps that search itself reveals that God has been drawing you all along. Because what if your desire to return did not begin with you? What if His grace has been gently pursuing you even during your quiet season? What if the thoughts that keep bringing you back are not evidence of His absence, but evidence of His... Because God's pursuit is often quieter than we expect, not forceful, not condemning, not demanding, patient. Janelle persisted. He does not shame His children back in the relationship. He invites them again and again. And perhaps right now, He is not asking you to explain everything. He is not demanding perfect answers. He is not waiting for flawless faith. He is simply inviting you to stop hiding. Because hiding has exhausted you. Trying to earn your way back has exhausted you. Trying to appear strong has exhausted you. Trying to understand everything has exhausted you. And perhaps what your heart needs most is not another burden. Perhaps it needs permission to rest. But then another fear appears. If I return, where do I even begin? After all this time, how do I pray again? Do I need to make big promises? Do I need to rebuild everything at once? Do I need to become the person I used to be? And perhaps the answer is much simpler and much gentler than you have imagined. Because returning to God has never begun with grand promises. It has always begun with something far smaller and far more beautiful. A conversation. Maybe one of the reasons you have delayed returning to prayer is because you have made the process far more complicated than God ever intended. You think you need to rebuild everything immediately? You think you need to make promises you will never break? You think you need to recover the passion you once had before you can begin again? You think you need to become the person you used to be? But perhaps God is not asking you to become who you used to be. Perhaps He is simply inviting you to come as you are right now. Tired, confused, hopeful, fearful, honest. Because relationship does not begin with performance. It begins with presence. And maybe that is what your heart has forgotten. You do not have to climb your way back to God. You do not have to impress Him. You do not have to repay Him. You do not have to make grand speeches. You do not have to explain every failure. You do not even have to know exactly what to say. Because returning often begins with something incredibly small. Something so simple that many people overlook it. A conversation. Not a perfect conversation. Not a long conversation. Just a real one. Maybe something as simple as, God, I miss you. Or perhaps, Lord, I don't even know how to pray anymore. Or, I've been tired. I've been afraid. I've been disappointed. I've been hiding. I want to come back, but I don't know how. And maybe that kind of honesty is far more beautiful to God than polished words. Because prayer was never meant to be a performance. It was always meant to be relationship. And relationships are built one conversation at a time. Not one perfect day at a time. Not one flawless month at a time. One conversation. One moment of dependence. One step. One surrender. One honest sentence. And perhaps this changes the way you think about spiritual growth. because many people imagine growth as something dramatic, sudden, powerful, instant. But often, God works differently. Growth is usually quiet, slow, daily, ordinary. And because it is ordinary, people sometimes miss how profound it really is. Trust grows slowly, peace grows slowly, healing grows slowly, faith grows slowly. And perhaps that is frustrating for the part of you that wants immediate results. Because fear always demands certainty. Fear wants guarantees. Fear wants instant transformation. Fear wants to know everything will be fixed immediately. But trust grows differently. Trust develops through daily dependence, not through dramatic promises. And perhaps that is why making huge commitments often leaves people discouraged. They promise they will never struggle again. They promise they will pray perfectly. They promise they will never doubt. They promise they will never become weak. And then life happens. They become tired again. They become distracted again. They become anxious again. And suddenly, shame returns. Not because God rejected them, but because they expected themselves to be stronger than human beings were designed to be. Perhaps God has never been asking for impossible promises. Perhaps He has simply been asking for dependence. Because dependence is very different from perfection. Perfection says, I can do this on my own. Dependence says, I need you. Perfection tries to impress. Dependence learns to trust. Perfection fears weakness. Dependence understands weakness. Perfection becomes discouraged by failure. Dependence keeps returning. And maybe one of the greatest signs of spiritual maturity is not never falling. Maybe it is learning to keep returning again and again and again. Not because you are strong, but because He is faithful. Because every relationship contains moments of reconnection. No healthy relationship survives through perfection. Healthy relationships survive through grace, through patience, through forgiveness, through continual return. And perhaps God understands this better than anyone, because He knows your humanity. He knows your thoughts. He knows your fears. He knows your emotional exhaustion. He knows how anxiety affects the mind. He knows how disappointment affects hope. He knows how waiting affects trust. He knows. And maybe that simple truth is more comforting than you realize. You are fully known and still invited, fully seen and still loved, fully understood and still welcomed. Not after you improve, not after you become stronger, not after you fix everything. Now, because grace always speaks in the present. Fear says, later. Grace says, come now. Fear says, become worthy first. Grace says, you are invited. Fear says, hide. Grace says, draw near. And perhaps this invitation becomes especially important when your thoughts are overwhelmed, because anxiety often convinces you that spiritual growth requires complicated solutions. But sometimes the next step is much simpler. Perhaps it means talking to God while driving. Perhaps it means whispering a prayer before sleeping. Perhaps it means reading a few verses instead of trying to accomplish something massive. Perhaps it means sitting quietly and simply acknowledging His presence. Because small conversations matter, small moments matter, small acts of trust matter. And what seems insignificant today often becomes the foundation of deeper faith tomorrow. That is how trust grows. Not all at once, but little by little. And perhaps you have underestimated the power of small beginnings. Because fear despises small steps. Fear says they are not enough. Fear says they do not matter. Fear says real change should happen immediately. But throughout life, the most meaningful things often grow slowly. Healing grows slowly. Relationships grow slowly. Wisdom grows slowly. Character grows slowly. And peace often returns the same way, gradually, quietly, like sunrise. Not all at once, but little by little, darkness gives way to light. And maybe that is exactly what God has been doing. Not demanding dramatic change, not pressuring you with impossible expectations, but patiently inviting you into daily dependence. Because dependence creates something remarkable. It creates trust. And trust begins changing how you see everything. The future your fears, your disappointments, even your unanswered questions. Because something unexpected starts happening when shame loses its power. Fear no longer controls every thought. Anxiety no longer defines every moment. And peace begins returning not because all your circumstances have changed, but because your perspective is changing. And perhaps that transformation is more beautiful than you realize, because renewed spiritual growth rarely begins with certainty. It begins with trust, and when trust starts becoming stronger than fear, something remarkable begins happening inside the heart, something that many people spend years searching for. Not perfect answers, not perfect emotions, but something far deeper. Peace, something beautiful begins to happen when fear slowly loses its authority. Not all at once, not dramatically, not in a way that removes every question overnight, but quietly, gradually, almost you begin breathing differently, thinking differently, trusting differently, because peace is not always the absence of problems. And perhaps that realization changes everything. For a long time, maybe you thought peace would come when life became easier, when answers arrived, when prayers were fully understood, when anxiety disappeared, when uncertainty ended. But perhaps peace was never meant to depend on perfect circumstances. Because if peace required complete understanding, very few people would ever experience it. Life is filled with unanswered questions. There are seasons that remain confusing, prayers that take longer than expected, dreams that unfold differently, waiting that stretches further than you imagined. And yet somehow, people who trust God deeply discover something remarkable. Peace can exist even while questions remain, not because they understand everything, but because they have begun trusting the one who does. And maybe that is the transformation happening inside you. Not the disappearance of every fear, but the gradual realization that fear does not have to rule your heart anymore, because fear always demands certainty. Fear says, what if things never change? What if the future falls apart? What if God remains silent? What if you fail again? What if your faith isn't enough? What if you never recover? And if you listen closely, you will notice something about fear. It always points toward worst-case scenarios. It speaks in absolutes. It predicts disaster. It magnifies uncertainty. And perhaps for a long time, those thoughts have exhausted you. Not because you are weak, but because carrying fear every day is exhausting. Carrying shame is exhausting. Trying to control the future is exhausting. Trying to understand everything is exhausting. Trying to protect yourself from every possible disappointment is exhausting. And perhaps that exhaustion itself has been revealing something important. You were never meant to carry the weight of being your own source of peace, because human beings were never designed to control tomorrow. You were never meant to know everything. You were never meant to have every answer. You were never meant to sustain yourself through your own strength. And maybe that is why dependence is not weakness. Dependence is wisdom. Because trust acknowledges what pride struggles to accept. You are not God. You do not see everything. You do not understand everything. And you do not have to. Because peace grows when trust becomes stronger than the need for control. And perhaps this is where many people discover renewed spiritual growth. Not through extraordinary experiences, but through surrender. Not surrender as defeat. Surrender as trust. Trust that God is still working. Trust that His timing remains good. Trust that His silence does not equal absence. Trust that His love has not changed. Trust that your season has not surprised Him. And little by little, that trust begins affecting everything. Your thoughts become less driven by panic. Your prayers become less driven by performance. Your relationship with God becomes less driven by fear. And perhaps for the first time in a long time, you begin experiencing something your soul desperately missed. Rest. Not because life suddenly became simple, but because your heart no longer feels responsible for holding the universe together. And maybe that is one of the greatest gifts God gives His children. Not constant explanations, but the freedom to rest in His faithfulness. Because peace does not come from understanding every detail. Peace comes from knowing who holds every detail. And perhaps that peace begins very quietly. Maybe your prayers are still simple. Maybe your emotions still fluctuate. Maybe some questions remain unanswered. Maybe some fears still visit your mind. But they no longer define you, because trust is becoming stronger, and trust changes perspective. The future no longer feels like something you must survive alone. Waiting no longer feels meaningless. Silence no longer feels like punishment. Weakness no longer feels like failure, because you are beginning to understand something that fear tried to hide from you. God has been near all along, not only during your strongest moments, not only during your most faithful seasons, not only during the times when prayer felt easy. He has been near during the exhaustion, near during the near during the tears, near during the disappointment, near during the silence, near when you felt nothing, near when you questioned everything, near when he struggled to pray, near when shame convinced you to hide. And perhaps that realization changes the way you see your entire journey, because maybe this season was never evidence that God abandoned you. Maybe it became evidence that his faithfulness is greater than your fears. Because if his love survived your silence, then his love was never based on your performance. If his presence remained during your confusion, then his nearness was never dependent on your emotions. If his grace kept inviting you while you were hiding, then his heart was never waiting to condemn you. And slowly, something inside begins changing. Fear starts losing its voice. Shame starts losing its power. Anxiety no longer tells the entire story. And hope begins returning. Not loud hope, not emotional excitement, but steady hope. A hope that whispers, God is still here. I am not abandoned. I am not forgotten. I do not have to earn his love. I do not have to return perfectly. I only have to keep trusting. And perhaps that kind of hope is more powerful than dramatic feelings, because dramatic feelings come and go, but deep trust remains. And deep trust produces something extraordinary: peace. Not perfect peace, not the kind that eliminates every struggle, but the kind that steadies your soul in the middle of uncertainty, the kind that allows you to breathe again, the kind that reminds you that you are loved even when life feels confusing, the kind that survives unanswered questions. And maybe, without fully realizing it, you are already experiencing the beginning of that transformation. Because you are still here, still seeking, still longing, still hoping, still listening. And perhaps none of that is an accident. Perhaps grace has been leading you all along, because there is one final truth that brings everything together. One truth capable of silencing the fears that have followed you through this entire journey. One truth that answers the question you have carried since the beginning. What happens when you stop praying for a while? And the answer may be far more beautiful than you ever imagined. Because while you were worried that God had walked away, he never left. So what happens when you stop praying for a while? Perhaps this question has carried more fear than you ever realized, because beneath the question itself was another fear, a quieter fear, a deeper fear. The fear that maybe God stopped loving you. The fear that perhaps you disappointed him one too many times. The fear that your silence created a distance that could not be repaired. The fear that somehow, while you were struggling, God quietly walked away. But after everything we have explored, perhaps you can finally see the answer more clearly. He never left. Not when life became overwhelming. Not when your thoughts became anxious. Not when your prayers became shorter. Not when your heart became tired. Not when disappointment made you quiet. Not even when shame convinced you to hide. Because God's love was never sustained by your perfection, and God's faithfulness was never dependent on your consistency. He remained patiently, quietly, faithfully. Perhaps the greatest surprise is not that you stopped praying for a season. Perhaps the greatest surprise is discovering that his invitation never disappeared. Because while fear was saying, "You waited too long," grace was saying, "Come." While shame was saying, "You should hide," grace was saying, "Come." While guilt was saying, "You need to fix yourself first," grace was saying, "Come," again and again. Not because God ignores sin, not because spiritual growth does not matter, but because relationship has always been built on grace rather than performance. And maybe this changes how you understand your entire journey. Because perhaps your silence was never proof that faith had died. Perhaps it was evidence that you are human. A human being who became tired. A human being who struggled. A human being who experienced disappointment. A human being who needed grace. And perhaps grace is most beautiful when you finally stop trying to deserve it. Because many believers spend years trying to earn what God has already offered. They exhaust themselves trying to become worthy. They carry guilt they were never meant to carry. They live as though God's heart is reluctant. Meanwhile, He continues extending the same invitation. Come, not tomorrow. Not after you become stronger. Not after you understand everything. Not after you finally stop struggling. Now, because grace lives in the present. And maybe right now, God is not asking you for dramatic promises. He is not asking you to guarantee perfect consistency. He is not demanding emotional excitement. He is not requiring impressive prayers. Perhaps He is simply inviting you into relationship again. Not the relationship you had years ago. Not the version of faith you think you lost, but something even deeper. A relationship built not on feelings, but on trust. Not on fear, but on love. Not on performance, but on grace. Because perhaps this season has taught you something you could not have learned any other way. That God's love is stronger than your fears, that His faithfulness survives your weakness, that His presence remains during silence, that His grace reaches further than shame. And maybe that realization becomes the turning point, because now, instead of asking, "Have I disappointed God?" you begin asking, "How has He remained so faithful?" Instead of asking, "Did I ruin everything?" you begin asking, "How has His love remained so steady?" Instead of asking, "Why am I so weak?" you begin understanding, His strength was never dependent on mine. And perhaps that understanding brings something your heart has desperately needed. Peace, not because every prayer has been answered, not because every fear disappeared, not because every question has been resolved, but because you finally understand that silence is not abandonment. Waiting is not rejection. Weakness is not failure. And God's love is not fragile. Because even now, in this very moment, He remains near, near to your fears, near to your unanswered questions, near to your near to your exhaustion, near to your uncertainty, near to your heart. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you no longer need to be afraid of returning. Because you are not returning to disappointment. You are returning to love. You are not returning to condemnation. You are returning to grace. You are not returning to a God who kept score. You are returning to a Father who never stopped caring. And perhaps that is the answer your soul has been searching for all along. Nothing happened to God's love when you stopped praying for a while. Nothing happened to His patience. Nothing happened to His invitation. Nothing happened to His faithfulness. He remained exactly who He has always been. And perhaps right now, you do not need to make 100 promises. Perhaps you only need one honest sentence. "Lord, I'm here." That is enough to begin. Because relationships are renewed one conversation at a time. And maybe today is not about recovering everything you think you lost. Maybe today is simply about taking the next step. Not perfectly, not fearfully, but trustingly. And if this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to let others know in the comments what truth encouraged you the most. And if you want more biblical encouragement for everyday struggles, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can continue growing in faith, peace, and trust. And before you leave, remember this: the silence that frightened you never changed the heart of God. Because even when you stopped talking to Him for a season, He never stopped loving you.